My name is Arpan Banerjee. I'm a doctoral fellow at the Department of East Asian Studies, University of Delhi, and academic counselor here at IGNOU. And I've been teaching you the paper, Indian Government and Politics. And the code of this paper is BPSC 132. So I welcome you all to today's learning session. So let us begin. Let us continue from where we left off this paper, which is Indian Government and Politics. And the code of this paper is BPSC 132. So far in this paper, we have discussed block 1, which was pertaining to approaches to study Indian politics. And as part of that, we had studied 3 approaches. That is the liberal approach, the Marxist, and the Gandhian approach. So these were the 3 units that we have done in the first block. As part of the second block, we had discussed the unit 4, which was pertaining to basic features of the Indian Constitution. The second block was pertaining to the Indian Constitution, and as part of that, we discussed 3 units. The 4th unit was basic features of the Indian Constitution. The 5th unit was relating to the fundamental rights enshrined in the Indian Constitution, and the 6th unit was relating to the directive principles of state policy and fundamental duties which are enshrined in the Indian Constitution. And the 3rd block was pertaining to institutions. And as part of that, in the previous class, we had discussed the legislature, executive, and the judiciary, the legislative, executive, and judicial system that is prevalent in our country, that is India. So in today's class, we are going to study, we are going to finish the 4th block. We are going to discuss the 4th block, which is society and politics. And it consists of 2 units. The 10th unit is pertaining to caste, class, and tribe, which we are going to discuss first. And afterwards, we are going to discuss the 11th unit, which is pertaining to gender. So let us begin today's class with the 10th unit, that is caste, class, and tribe. So this unit, that is caste, class, and tribe, it is about identities. And identities, they basically denote relations among social groups. And some identities, they are hereditary. So the nature of such identities may undergo changes, but these identities, they remain. So caste is such an identity, and some identities, they are not hereditary. They depend upon the economic conditions, and such identities are called class. So some identities are defined by certain characteristics which members of such groups have. So such identities are known as tribes. So caste, class, and tribe are among several other identities such as religion, language, or region. So caste, class, and tribe are crucial identities that impact social, economic, and political aspects in India. So let us first discuss about caste. So caste denotes position of a social group in a hierarchy of relations. And this position is based on the birth of a person. And apart from the caste being hereditary, it is also endogamous. And it means that a person can marry within his or her caste. So these are notional features of caste, and traditionally every caste was assigned on the basis of specific occupation in society. The caste-based occupations also indicated the social hierarchy in the society. Different castes were grouped into 4 varnas, that is Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, and Shudras. The erstwhile untouchable castes, which are placed in the scheduled caste SC category in the government gazette, are known as Dalits. So over the years, especially after independence, these ideal features of castes have undergone significant changes. However, its 2 features, its hereditary nature and endogamy, remain largely enduring. According to Louis Dumont, the author of Homo Hierarchicus, different castes in India are placed in a graded hierarchy. And Louis Dumont, he argues that in power relationships among castes, Brahmins enjoy more decisive role than the Kshatriya, and Dumont's notion of caste has been challenged by Nicholas Dirks and others. So Dumont's notion was criticized as it failed to explain the social change, dynamism, and individualistic strivings even within the traditional Indian society. So Gerald Berman, he pointed out that the principle of Brahminical hierarchy was not uniformly followed by all Hindus, and he also criticized the Dumontian notion that power and economic factors are distinct and epiphenomenal to caste. And it has been pointed out by others that caste hierarchy is not a fixed hierarchy. Rather, it is context specific and fluid and contains seeds of contestation amongst various castes. So Nicholas Dirks cites ethnographic and textual evidence to demonstrate that Brahmins and their texts were not so central to the social fabric of Indian life. And according to this view, power relations and command over men and resources were more important. And Brahmins were merely ritual specialists, often subordinate to powerful ruling families. According to this view, the caste-based scriptural or Brahminical model of traditional India was an invention of the British Orientalists and ethnographers. So, however, caste played a very critical role in the Indian social reformers and nationalist perception of caste. It was certainly not a mere product of British imagination. Disagreeing with Louis Dumont, sociologist Dipankar Gupta argues that though different castes are placed in a hierarchical order, they have emerged as discrete caste or distinct caste identities. The policies of the state social welfare schemes for the welfare of marginalized groups, implementation of constitutional provisions, prohibiting caste-based untouchability, reservation for the scheduled castes in government jobs, political institutions, land reforms, etc., diluted the rigidity of caste relations. Specifically, the notion of purity and pollution do not impact the role of caste outside family as rigidly as it did earlier in the public sphere. This phenomena is called as secularization of caste by political scientists such as Rajni Kothari and D.L. Seth. So caste has played an important role in Indian democracy following the introduction of universal adult franchisee. With the commencement of Indian constitution, as every adult citizen of India got an opportunity to participate in the electoral democracy, caste became an important tool for political mobilization. So castes formed caste associations, and according to Lloyd Rudolph and Susan Rudolph, caste associations have played a crucial role in mobilizing the castes for getting their democratic rights. And in the book edited by Christophe Jaffrelot and Sanjay Kumar, that is Rise of the Plebeians, several scholars have argued that participation of Dalits and other backward castes in different states has increased, especially since the last decades of the 20th century. And this is a reflection of change in nature of caste in the post-independence period. Apart from caste associations, several parties which address the issues of specific castes or caste groups have emerged in India. So these parties aim to empower specific castes. In Uttar Pradesh, the Bahujan Samaj Party attempted to empower the majority sections, that is the Bahujan Samaj, mostly the Dalits and the backward classes. Similarly, in the 1970s and 80s, political parties led by former Prime Minister Chaudhry Charan Singh, the Bharatiya Kranti Dal, the Bharatiya Lok Dal or the Lok Dal, they mobilized the backward classes farming communities in North India. In Tamil Nadu, the Dravid Munnetra Kazhagam and the All India Anna Dravid Munnetra Kazhagam, they mobilized the backward classes or the Dravidas. So support bases of the Congress, especially till the 1980s, and that of the Bharatiya Janata Party from 2014, it consists of multiple castes. So the policies of the government led by these parties, they devised policies to mobilize their support, and this helped them to get support of various. Harish Damodaran in India's New Capitalists, he explains that caste background of the capitalist, since the last few decades of the 20th century became wider than it was till a few years after independence. So since in India the industries, they form a smaller proportion of economy in comparison to agriculture, the industrialist and working classes, they form smaller part of classes. So Lloyd Rudolph and Susan Rudolph in their work In Pursuit of Lakshmi, they underline that working classes, they form a tiny section of Indian classes. Classes can be observed in agrarian sector also. But composition and formation of classes in India's agriculture have varied in different regions. So in the post-independence period, the agrarian classes can be described as follows. So the landlords and tenants, the kulaks or the rich peasants or the middle peasants, and the agricultural laborers or the marginal and small farmers and footloose laborers. So landlords and tenants, they generally existed before the implementation of land reforms in different states in India. However, they have not completely disappeared in every state. In several parts of the country, new classes they emerged after the abolition of zamindari following implementation of land reforms. These classes came to be known as rich farmers or kulaks or self-cultivating middle farmers. In the areas which have witnessed green revolution, these classes got involved in cash crops. So these areas, they also have seen the emergence of agricultural laborers who work on the land of the landowning classes. And besides this, there are classes who own small landholdings, and these landholdings are not enough to meet their family needs. Apart from working in their land, they work in others' land or somewhere else. These are known as marginal or small farmers. And apart from these classes, there are some social groups who are not engaged in some fixed occupation. They do whatever work is available to them, and they do not own land or they do not have any durable means of livelihood. So, in his book Footloose Labor, Jan Bremen, he terms these classes as footloose labor. So classes have close relationship with caste, and although all classes are found in all castes, generally the lower castes, that is the Dalits and the lower sections, they have larger share of poorer classes than the high castes. So the rich farmers or middle farmers mostly belong to high castes, and middle classes such as Jats, Yadavs, Marathas, Reddis, Kammas, Bokaligas and Lingayats. So the agricultural laborers, small and marginal farmers, footloose laborers, they mostly belong to Dalits and lower backward classes. Besides industry and agriculture, there are classes in service sectors which consists of multiple middle classes. Middle classes generally denote those classes who are engaged in salaried occupations in public or private sectors, and they also include professionals or self-employed persons such as doctors, lawyers, or journalists. And middle classes are not homogeneous groups. Depending on their economic conditions and position in public or private jobs, middle classes can be grouped as lower, middle, or upper middle classes. So now let us discuss the third part of this unit, that is tribe. So tribes refer to a group of people who share some characteristics which are different from those of castes. Caste is basically associated with Hindu communities, though there are castes among other religions such as Muslims or Sikhs, and social status and caste occupations have been traditionally defined by birth into caste and by endogamy. So the principal defining characteristic of a tribe is not birth into a specific religion. Tribes belong to different religions and they are animists also. So that is Christian, Buddhist or Muslim. Some scholars regard tribals as indigenous. In Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, and a section of tribals in Assam are also known as Adivasis. So tribals in India, they have been subjected to prolonged exploitation and deprivation. Tribe as a concept was introduced by the British during the 19th century in India. It was used to differentiate the communities which did not fit into the definition of castes. The concept of tribe was officially defined in the Government of India Act 1935. In India, tribals predominantly inhabit the states of Northeast India, with largest number of tribes in India: Jharkhand, earlier Chota Nagpur, Andaman and Nicobar Islands, and some other regions in the country such as Odisha, Maharashtra, Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, Nilgiris, Central India, Gujarat, and Rajasthan. So, according to Article 341 of the Constitution, the President of India may specify tribes or tribal communities, groups within certain tribes in the state for the purpose of the Constitution. In view of this notification, the Parliament may include or exclude tribes from the list of scheduled tribes in a state. The Constitution of India has several provisions for the welfare of the scheduled tribes in India. Article 342 provides for special administrative measures for the welfare of the scheduled tribes. The state shall provide special provisions for the welfare of such tribes, such as reservation in public offices and in the Parliament and Vidhan Sabhas, Article 16, Article 46 and Article 335, consideration of members of these groups in making appointment to services, etc., given in Article 30 and Article 330 and 332. The Constitution also ensures protection of the tribals' languages, dialects and culture by Article 29. So Article 335, it talks about consideration of members of the scheduled tribes in making appointment to the services, and Article 330, it reserves seats for scheduled tribes according to the proportion of their population in the Lok Sabha, and Article 332, it reserves seats for the scheduled tribes according to the proportion of their population in the state legislative assemblies. So the sixth schedule provides for establishment of autonomous district councils in the hills inhabited by the tribes in northeast India. So there are 4 states which have autonomous district councils. So Assam is one such state which has the Bodoland Autonomous District Council, the Karbi Anglong Autonomous District Council, and also moving on to Meghalaya, which has the Garo, Khasi, and Jaintia Autonomous District Councils. Then in Assam there is the Dimasa Autonomous District Council as well. Then moving on, in Tripura, we have the Tripura Autonomous District Council, which represents the Kokborok tribes of Tripura. Then in moving on to Mizoram, in Mizoram we have the Chakma Autonomous District Council. So these are the only 4 states which have autonomous district councils under 6th schedule. The rest of the tribal areas in the northeast as well as in the rest of the country, they are covered under 5th schedule. So the reason that 6th schedule has been implemented only in 4 states and not in other states, recently there was a demand from Ladakh to include it in the 6th schedule, but it was not met. The reason is that in these states there is a homogeneity in the tribes. So for example, in the autonomous district councils, when they are created for a specific tribe. For example, the Garo autonomous district or Jharkhand, then we do not have the 6th schedule. We have rather the 5th schedule, and as per the 5th schedule, there is the Panchayat extension to scheduled areas, or the PESA Act as well, which ensures the participation of the tribal population in the 5th schedule areas in the local governance. This was implemented in 1996. So the 5th schedule areas, they provide for the establishment of tribal advisory councils, and the powers of the tribal advisory councils are comparatively much lesser than that of the autonomous district councils. So the 5th schedule area, they provide for establishment of tribal advisory council in tribal dominated areas of mainland India. Tribal advisory councils, they consist of members of which 3/4 are to be representatives of the scheduled tribes in the legislative assembly of the respective states. The function of the council is to advise the state government on matters pertaining to welfare and interests of the tribes in the state. Autonomous district councils, on the other hand, we understood. The Constitution of India contains many special assertions for the tribes. Now let us discuss the characteristics of the tribes. So tribes are generally identified by certain features. It is important to note that as tribal societies are undergoing transformation, the characteristics of tribes are getting affected by the transformation. However, we can identify certain features which are associated with tribes. These features are given below. So first, traditionally tribes have been inhabiting hills and forests, which are generally located in areas which lack basic facilities, roads, schools, health facilities. The second characteristic is that the agriculture in such areas mostly involve family labor. In the tribal dominated areas, jhum or shifting cultivation is practiced, and people are engaged in livestock, fishing, hunting, forestry, etc. And construction sector, mining and quarrying is also going on there. So the usage of relatively traditional means of cultivation is observed in these tribal areas, and the tribals, they do not have access to developed market to sell their products. In comparison to women in the non-tribal societies, women generally enjoy more equality in the tribal societies, and tribal chiefs or community leaders play decisive roles in the adjudication of affairs within the tribes. So during the post-independence period, the tribal communities have witnessed changes. However, these changes have not impacted tribes of all regions equally. There exist inequalities in their economic, educational standards within the same tribes and within the same regions as well. So the concept of regional deprivation also comes into play here. These changes have mainly occurred due to policies of the state and central governments made according to the special provisions of the Constitution. The sixth schedule and fifth schedule of the Constitution, they protect the customs and economic interests as well as political rights of tribes in the hills and plain areas, and policies for reservation in public employment. The elected bodies and welfare schemes have contributed to change in tribal society to a considerable extent. As a result of these changes, new classes have emerged among different tribes in India. These classes are middle classes such as teachers, engineers, doctors, businessmen, and politicians. Some of them are contributing to the welfare of tribal societies. Besides the rise of new classes, intrusion of market has disrupted the tribal economy, leading to ecological degradation and depletion and extraction of natural resources. The tribal inhabited areas have been subjected to exploitation and they have suffered deprivation as well. Now let us discuss about tribes and political movements. So tribes in different regions of India have been engaged in political movements against their exploitation and for their political autonomy from time to time. So during the 19th century, the tribes were involved in a series of revolts against the colonial rule and its interference in the lives, culture, and rights of tribal communities. Consequently, an administrative system for tribal areas was created, which was different from the general Indian administration. The distinct legislative and executive measures were adopted, which primarily aimed at protecting and safeguarding the interests and welfare of the tribes. From 1874 onwards, tribes or tribal areas, that is, the areas that had a majority of tribal population, were governed by the scheduled district. As per this act, the government was required to specify what laws were to be enforced in the scheduled areas or districts, and these laws were different from the ones applied elsewhere in India. And these provisions were continued in post-independent India despite their colonial roots and origins. In post-independence period, also the tribals have been involved in movements for ending backwardness of their regions and their political marginalization. Through the movements, they seek political and regional autonomy by rearranging existing relations between vertical units of governance, the local self-governance institutions, state, and the center. So the rearrangement of these relations range from district, regional level autonomy within a state to creation of a new state out of an existing state, or even to getting a sovereign state. So for example, Meghalaya was created out of Assam in 1972, and Assam was also bifurcated to create other states as well. For example, Mizoram, Manipur as well. Some tribal groups, they have been involved in insurgency, which means they get popular support in their movement, which often become violent. For example, in Nagaland. Among the examples of different types of autonomy movements in the Northeast India are the movements of Nagas in the Naga inhabited areas of Nagaland, and of the Mizos in Mizoram, and of the Bodo tribes in Assam. So caste is a hereditary and endogamous category. Although nature of caste has undergone changes, it remains an enduring identity, and caste-based hierarchies, they do exist. But different castes have emerged as discrete units, and castes have formed caste association. So tribes, they are identified on the basis of some characteristics: their closeness to natural resources such as forests, relatively more equality in comparison to women in non-tribal societies, decisive role of the tribal chiefs in affairs of the community, and relatively traditional tools in agriculture. However, these characteristics are undergoing considerable changes. So we have discussed the 10th unit, which was relating to caste, class, and tribes. Now let us move on to the 11th unit of this paper, that is pertaining to gender. So people in a society, they can be identified on the basis of language, religion, caste, gender, tribe, etc. And in this unit, which is about gender, it is essential to know what gender is and how it is different from a related concept, that is sex. So generally, many people consider that sex and gender are the same. This is not true. There is a difference between the sex and the gender. Sex denotes biological identity of a person, and gender, it signifies the role of social, economic, political, and other factors in determining the position of sex in society. It means the levels of social status, economic conditions, and power positions of men, women, or transgenders are determined by the social, economic, and political conditions in which they are placed. As men, women, and transgenders grow in different circumstances, they do not enjoy similar status in society. And there exists social hierarchy, economic and political inequalities in their positions. In our society, men are placed in higher positions in relation to women, men, and transgenders. So this is reflected in relation to their position to inherit property, choice of career opportunities in matter of marriage or clothing or social behavior. Men enjoy more freedom than the women or transgenders. Their unequal positions in society show their different positions in relation to gender. So the society in which men enjoy superior power than the women is known as patriarchal societies, and in the societies where women theoretically enjoy power in certain aspects of societies are matriarchal societies. So these are also reflected in the value system in a society. So patriarchal values do not treat women with equality. So Kate Millett, in her book, famous feminist scholar Kate Millett, who has written her book Sexual Politics in 1970, explains how power or patriarchy shapes gender relations. And Kate Millett was influenced by the feminist philosopher Simone de Beauvoir and her work, that is The Second Sex, which was released in 1949. In India, with exception of 3 tribes in Meghalaya, that is Garos, Khasis, and Jaintiyas, Nayars in Kerala, and some tribes in Andaman Nicobar Islands, patriarchy it exists. Among these tribes, matrilineal system exists. However, as Tiplut Nongbri, a sociologist, underlines with reference to the Khasis, matrilineal system does not treat women equally in some respects. So now let us discuss about gender and issues. Since the 1980s, the scope of women's movements at the local levels, that is villages and towns, and at the higher levels and range of issues raised by them have widened. However, these movements have not occurred with similar effectiveness everywhere. Gender-related issues are not the problems only of women, men, or transgender. Rather, they concern all. Their solution also lies in collaborative efforts of all. However, as the gender's position is determined by unequal location of men, women, and transgender in social, political, and economic relations, it is women who are apparently placed in the most vulnerable position. Several problems continue to pose a challenge to their emancipation or empowerment. So many practices abating gender discrimination, they have been legally banned and do not get approval from every section of the society. Despite this, however, they continue to exist. They exist in families, public places, and in workplaces. Some examples of gender-based discrimination are as follows: rape, domestic violence, discrimination of daughters, dowry, bride burning, sex determination tests in the public places, cases of harassment in society, child marriage, discrimination by some traditional caste panchayats, and in workplaces as well. To stop the harassment of women in the workplaces, the Supreme Court, in a very famous case of Bhavri Devi versus state of Rajasthan, it issued the Vishakha guidelines, and it directed the government, although it took the government 16 years to frame those guidelines. The Supreme Court instructed the government to frame certain guidelines for the prevention of harassment of women at the workplaces, and these came to be known as the Vishakha guidelines. These were issued by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court directed the government of India to frame these guidelines to protect women from harassment in workplaces in the Bhavri Devi versus State of Rajasthan case of 1997, in which the Supreme Court made its judgment on the basis of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to which India is also a signatory. However, it took the government 16 years to frame those guidelines, and in 2013, finally, the Vishakha guidelines, they came into effect, which are relating to the prevention of harassment of women in the workplace. So besides this, women are also discriminated in getting wages for their work, which is equal to the men's work. So Article 39, Clause 1 of the Directive Principles of the State Policy, they clearly state that equal wage for equal work for both men and women. So this is a part of the directive principle. Although this is non-justiciable, Yet it is the responsibility of the state to ensure this. However, we see that despite 7.5 decades of independence, this has not been implemented. Despite the state formulating the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act and the subsequent Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, what we observe is that women, they are not getting equal wages for the equal work that they do in comparison to men. So now let us discuss about gender and development. So gender-based inequality is largely rooted in social and economic disparities and lack of representation of women and transgender in decision-making institutions. It can be argued that if women they become economically independent and get educated and get political representation, their equality can be achieved. And recently, through the 106th constitutional amendment, which has also been termed as the Nari Shakti Adhiniyam, the government of India, it reserved 33%, one third of the seats in the Lok Sabha for the women. And although economic independence help in reduction of gender-based discrimination, it is not a sufficient condition. Such conditions can be supplemented by change in the patriarchal values. It means that men, women, and transgenders are entitled for equal treatment as human beings. So, gender-based discrimination is thus embedded in the level of human development. Human development means development of human beings in terms of economic independence or having viable means of livelihood, getting proper education and keeping good health and getting respect as a human being. Even as job, education, and health are important factors to remove gender-based inequality, they are inadequate without being accompanied by provisions for self-respect and dignity. So that is possible by change in patriarchal values that support gender-based discrimination. So Amartya Sen in Development as Freedom argues that development in terms of developing capabilities in human beings, that is health and education, result in providing freedom to human beings. Now let us discuss about gender and movements, and let us discuss about the historical background of gender-based movements. So the trajectory of women's movements in India, they can be traced to pre-independence period. These movements, they addressed almost all kinds of issues concerning women. Some of these remain focused on contemporary women's movements in India. Some social reformers played leading role in combating some practices which undermined women's rights and dignity. For example, Savitribai Phule, she took initiative to provide education to women in the middle of the 19th century, along with her husband Jyotiba Phule. So, contemporary movements in India to end gender-based discrimination can be traced to the pre-independence period. In the early decades of the 19th century, Raja Ram Mohan Roy and Vidya Lankar, they fought against the practice of sati. And in 1817, Pandit Mrityunjay Vidyalankar declared that sati had no shastric sanction. Similarly, in the 1850s, Pandit Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar argued that shastras were not opposed to the remarriage of a widow. 1 year later, Governor William Bentinck prohibited sati in his province, that is Bengal. It took 11 years for this prohibition to get extended to other parts of India as the Sati Prohibition Act of 1829. Against the prohibition of widow remarriage, a widow remarriage association was established in Madras in 1871. In 1878, Virasalingam started the Rajamundri Social Reform Association, focusing mainly on widow remarriage. Jyotiba Rao Phule, he founded the Satya Shodhak Samaj to end social evils associated with castes which negatively affected women also. And her wife also took initiative, that is the Savitribai Phule, to provide education to women, especially belonging to the lower castes. So Swami Dayanand Saraswati, he started the Arya Samaj movement to initiate reforms within the Hindus and interpreted the Shastras to argue that men and women were equals. And Swami Dayanand Saraswati, he opposed polygamy and child marriage and supported compulsory education for boys and girls both, and suggested that equal stress on tradition and modernity through the compulsory learning of Sanskrit and English should be placed. And Dayanand Saraswati, he raised the age of marriage for girls and boys to 16 and 25 respectively. And due to the influence of the social reformers, the British government made laws which banned custom of sati and child marriage, permitted women to remarry, and women leaders they supported by the Congress demanded equal voting rights and representation for women in legislative bodies. And All India Women's Conference was also set up in the 1920s to spread education among women. One of the foremost such Congress leaders who campaigned for the rights of women was Sarojini Naidu. So, in the post-independence period, if we talk about gender-based discrimination and inequality, they became a focus of studies in social sciences during 1975 to 1985, which was known as the International Women's Decade. So, gender studies became priority agenda of research of the Indian Council of Social Sciences Research (ICSSR) and the University Grants Commission (UGC). In several universities, centers for women's studies were established. Some scholars argue that the women's movement in India is influenced by women's movement in the West, but some scholars disagree with this view and argue, scholars like Simantini Niranjana, they argue that feminist movement in India is rooted in culture and national history of India. And patriarchal values, they impact the attitude of the state institutions and society towards gender-based inequality and discrimination. And a large number of persons in the society are not averse to the gender-based discrimination. They support practices and customs which endorse gender-based discrimination, which includes sati, ban of entry of women in certain religions. The state, they share common patriarchal values. However, along with the presence of patriarchal and misogynist elements in the society and the state, there are several organizations, activists, scholars, intellectuals, and leaders also who attempt to end gender-based discrimination and inequality. And they strive to end male dominance and seek equality for all genders, men, women, and transgenders. Indeed, opposition to gender-based discrimination and search for gender equality has assumed the form of women's and LGBTQ movement. These movements address gender-based issues, have leaderships, organizations, and patterns of mobilization. On the basis of ideological orientations, Gail Omvedt categorizes women's movements into two types. That is the women's equality movements and the women's liberation movements. The former, that is the women's equality movements, they have a specific goal, that is to abolish patriarchal inequality. And they do not directly target the existing family, social and economic structure. The movement for women's liberation, it directly challenges feudal hierarchy and sexual division of labor. So women's movements, they adopt different ways, such as demonstrations, dharnas, mass petitions, social media, etc., to underline their demands and pressurize the government to accept them. So these ways also help to generate consciousness and sensitize people about gender discrimination and gender inequality. The most recent case of gender-based infringement of human rights included the Nirbhaya case that took place in Delhi in December 2012, and one student nicknamed as Nirbhaya died because she was gang raped and tortured by 6 men while she was traveling in a bus. One of the culprits was the driver of the bus. This is an example of how patriarchal and misogynist values can endanger the life and honor of women. So the incident, it provoked massive public protest in Delhi and other cities. The court sentenced the 4 culprits to be hanged till death. One of the culprits committed suicide and one was sent to juvenile home. The government also set up the Justice Verma Committee to suggest as to how gender-based discriminations can be ended. The Justice Verma Committee, it made recommendations for ending gender-based discrimination. Gender discrimination and inequalities are intertwined with caste hierarchy and economic inequality. While women and transgenders from all castes, religions, tribes, or economic strata, they face gender-based discrimination. Those women who are from the lower castes and who are from the economically poor classes, they face multiple forms of discrimination. So gender discrimination along with caste-based discrimination. So it is like a dual burden for them. So a Dalit or a tribal woman agricultural laborer is more vulnerable to gender, caste and class-based discrimination. However, organizations such as Self-Employed Women's Association, that is SEWA, which was founded by Ila Bhatt, Working Women's Forum and Annapurna Mahila Mandal, they empower women by carrying out economic activities. Leadership in women's movements generally belong to educated upper castes and middle classes. Now let us discuss about the LGBTQ or transgender persons. So the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual and queer people, that is the LGBTQ or transgender persons. Let us discuss about them. So gender-based movements are part of new social movements. The new social movements refer to those social movements or collective action which are different from the movements which occurred prior to the 1980s in the following ways. So these movements, the gender-based movement or the new social movements, they are movements of those social groups or social classes which were not visibly involved in collective mobilization. They addressed new kinds of issues and they claim to be politically apolitical, or they are not affiliated to any political party. Among such groups are included transgender groups, who are also known as LGBTQ. According to the Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Bill of 2016, a transgender person is one who is A. Neither wholly female or male, B. a combination of female and male, or C. neither female nor male. Such a person's gender does not match the gender assigned at birth and includes trans men and trans women, persons with intersex variations and gender queers. Transgenders, they face discrimination due to the status of their gender. They face social stigma, discrimination in getting employment in public or private institutions and within their families. So the LGBTQ groups in India, they have been mobilizing themselves to influence the lawmakers to make laws to end their multiple discrimination and provide them dignity and self-respect. So right to self-identification is amongst their main demands. In response to their movement, Tiruchi Siva placed a private members bill in Rajya Sabha on December 12, 2014, and in Rajya Sabha the bill was passed unanimously on 24th April 2015. On 6 September 2018, the Supreme Court legalized homosexuality in India. The Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Bill 2019 was passed by the Lok Sabha on August 5, 2019. So the bill prohibits discrimination against transgender persons, including denial of service or unfair treatment in relation to education, employment, healthcare, access to or enjoyment of goods, facilities, opportunities available to the public, right to movement, right to reside, rent, own or otherwise occupy property, opportunity to hold public or private office, and access to a government or private establishment in whose care or custody a transgender person is. It also sought to provide right to self-identification to the transgender persons. And it will be left to a transgender person whether she or he wants to be identified a man, woman or transgender. The bill also suggested that the government should introduce some welfare measures for the transgender persons. So gender is one of the markers of identity of an individual, and it is different from sex. Sex indicates biological status of a person, and gender shows how the status of a man, woman or transgender is shaped by the social, economic and political circumstances. There are three kinds of gender: men, women and transgender or LGBTQ. In most of India, patriarchy defines the relationship between men and women. Men enjoy more rights than women and are generally considered superior to women by the society. Women face multiple types of discrimination and inequalities in the society. However, among some tribes of India, such as the Khasis, Garos, and Jayantiyas, and among Nayars in Kerala and some tribes in Andaman and Nicobar, matrilineal system defines the position of men and women in society. In such system, women have more rights than the men in a patriarchal system. Gender-based inequalities and discrimination, they occur because of the domination of patriarchal values and lack of economic independence to women or transgenders. So provisions that ensure participation of women and transgender in the decision-making bodies, they can help in eliminating gender-based discrimination and inequality. And since the 1980s, growth of consciousness about such discrimination has resulted in women's and transgenders movements. Consequently, laws against practice of sati, dowry, domestic violence, for example, the Dowry Prevention Act was brought in 1960 to curb this practice of dowry. However, what we observe is that this practice, it still goes on in a much more covert way. So laws against practice of sati, it was brought in 1829, and the last recorded case of sati in India, it took place in the 1980s. So laws against practice of sati, dowry, domestic violence, etc., and laws protecting the rights to transgender have been passed. So since the 1980s, there has been a growth of consciousness about such discrimination that has been taking place against the women and transgender, which has resulted in women's and transgenders movements. And provisions that ensure participation of women and transgenders in the decision making bodies, they can help in eliminating gender based inequalities and discrimination. So in this paper, we have discussed two units today. The first unit that we discussed was the relating to caste, class, and tribe. So in that we discussed that caste is a hereditary and endogamous category, and although nature of caste has undergone changes, it remains an enduring identity. And caste-based hierarchies, they still exist, but different castes, they have emerged as discrete units. And castes have formed caste associations, and they have contributed to increasing role of castes in Indian democracy. So, in the past few years, lower castes participation in democratic process has increased, especially since the 1990s, since the coalition politics, the era of coalition politics. Class, it denotes relationship of a group or person with the resources and their distribution. Unlike caste, class is not a permanent category. Class, it changes. Class of a person may change with the change in his or her relations with the resources and their distribution. There are rich farmers, kulaks, middle farmers, and agricultural laborers, small or marginal farmers, and footloose laborers in agricultural sector, capitalists and working classes in industrial sector, and middle classes in the salaried or professional groups. And finally, in this unit, we had discussed about the tribes. Now, tribes, they are identified on the basis of some characteristics, their closeness to natural resources such as forests. So, during the British era, the Britishers, they prohibited the tribals and from accessing the forest produce, and termed them as criminal tribes. So, these discriminatory policies were implemented by the British regime. So in the tribes, we observe there is relatively more equality for women in comparison to non-tribal societies, and there are many matrilineal tribal societies as well. For example, the Khasi tribes of Meghalaya. And there is a decisive role of the tribal chiefs in affairs of the community, and relatively traditional tools are used in agriculture. However, these characteristics are undergoing considerable changes. And as part of gender, which is the second unit that we discussed today, that is the 11th unit of this paper, we discussed that there is a difference between gender and sex. Sex, it indicates biological status of a person, and gender, it shows how the status of a man, woman, or transgender is shaped by the social, economic, and political circumstances. So we discussed how the patriarchal society, it in a way discriminates or affects the women and the transgender community in India. and we have discussed the multiple types of discrimination and inequalities that are faced by women and the transgender communities, and we have also discussed some of the ways through which these discriminations can be tackled. And gender-based inequalities and discrimination, they occur because of the domination of patriarchal values and the lack of economic independence to women or transgenders. So provisions that ensure participation of women and transgender in the decision making bodies, they can help in eliminating gender-based discrimination and inequalities, and consequently laws against certain discriminatory practices like sati, dowry, domestic violence, and laws protecting the rights to transgender, they also have been passed. The most recent example being the 106th constitutional amendment, which reserved one-third seats for women in the Lok Sabha, that is the Nari Shakti Adhiniyam. So, thank you so much for joining today's class. Namaste.